This lecture is on Rothbard's Economics of Taxation, is the title of it. And Murray Rothbard is one of the relatively few Austrians who wrote a significant amount on the economics of public finance, one of the main subdisciplines in economics that there is and has been for a long time. And I don't know why that is, but even Mises didn't write that much on the economics of public finance. He was preoccupied with other things, the great socialist calculation debate, capitalism in general, and monetary theory. But Rothbard probably wrote as much as any of the older Austrians, the last couple of generations, on public finance. And Walter Block covered some of in one of his lectures a couple days ago, covered some of the technical aspects of what Rothbard had to say on tax incidence, for example. And so, and I had included that in my notes here, but I think I'm going to drop that since he already talked about it, and some of you probably were there. But what I thought I would do was point out how Murray Rothbard had a different lens through which he looked at public finance, or the study of public finance, than a lot of other economists. But this lens, if you will, was based, among other things, on his understanding of the intellectual tradition going back several hundred years studying public finance, among other things. And this tradition was much more skeptical of the state than the modern public finance economists. I studied public finance in graduate school under James Buchanan. I took 3 courses in it. And one of the first things I learned is that almost all of the public finance that was research that was done in America and elsewhere in the 1940s, 50s, 60s, that era, was done under a model of government that Buchanan used to call, and probably still calls, the Benevolent Despot model. And the models or theories that were put together would pretty much presume if we had a benevolent despot in charge of the government who wanted to achieve fairness and equity and prosperity for all, what kind of tax system would he choose? And so if you, in that era, if you picked up like the leading public finance textbook by Musgrave, a man named Musgrave, that's pretty much what you would see. They didn't actually say, let's assume we have a benevolent despot, but they would say things like a government that wants to maximize fairness and efficiency, economic efficiency, would choose these principles of taxation. It would use these ideas to guide what kind of taxes we had and what rates would be set and so forth. And Buchanan himself, of course, in being a major player in the public choice revolution, or the economic analysis of government, took a very different approach himself, as did Murray Rothbard. And so there's sort of a parallel there between these two men, Buchanan and Rothbard. I know Buchanan, beginning in the late 40s, when he got out of school at the University of Chicago, started writing some articles that were very influential in the area of public finance, and he was later cited when he won the Nobel Prize for this work. At the same time, Murray Rothbard, maybe a few years later, was doing something similar, was dropping this benevolent despot assumption, and as a result came to some very different conclusions about what kind of tax system we should have if we're going to have a tax system. Okay, I can recall one book that Buchanan wrote on this, that it was a standard neoclassical model building exercise, but the basic assumption was that government is an exploiter and a revenue maximizer. That's what motivates government, not peace and prosperity and equality. And it was co-authored with a very well-known Australian economist, Geoffrey Brennan, published by University Press, and then when it was reviewed in the Economic Journal, which is a top-flight academic journal, the reviewer called them fascists. He used the word fascist for doing this, and they just laughed it off. But I'm sure they would have had even worse words for Murray had Murray Rothbard published on this area. And let me give you some examples of what I'm talking about here. With Murray's different approach to the study of taxation. Like Buchanan, he didn't believe you could study taxation apart from spending. The budget is the budget. I mean, you can't divorce the government budget from the revenue side. The expenditure side and the revenue side are all part of the budget. And so when you analyze taxes, you have to also analyze spending. And in his book, Power and Market, when he talks about taxes, he quotes Mises as saying this: keep in mind when you study government, whether it's taxes or anything, keep in mind this is what government is. And so he quotes Mises as saying, government interference always means either violent action or the threat of such action. Government is, in the last resort, the employment of armed men, of policemen, gendarmes, soldiers, prison guards, and hangmen. The essential feature of government is the enforcement of its decrees by beating, killing, and imprisoning. Those who are asking for more government interference are asking ultimately for more compulsion and less freedom, end quote. And of course that's very different from anything you'd read in a public finance textbook about the benevolent despot and how he's just trying to achieve fairness and happiness for all of us. And one of the things that really set Murray apart from others in his analysis of government in general and taxation in particular is he was a big fan of the political philosophy of John C. Calhoun, who if you read the essays in Logic of Action, Ethics of Liberty, when he mentions political philosophers, American political philosophers, Calhoun is at the top of the list. And you can read Calhoun's his book, A Disquisition on Government, who is considered by a lot of people to be the last of the American founding fathers in terms of his philosophical outlook on government. He died in 1850, so he was much younger than the founding generation, but he was the last of that era who thought like Jefferson. He was a Jeffersonian. And he carried on a very old tradition that Murray was familiar with, but modern public finance economists are just totally have no idea about this. And this tradition was known as the French Industrial School several hundred years ago. I'll get you a reference here. Let's see. Yeah, the French Industrial School. And among the early authors, and we're talking 250 years ago, I'll just write down some of the names of the authors that are known here. Augustin Thierry was one. Charles Comte. Destutt de Tracy. I think his name is up here somewhere on the wall. Benjamin Constant. And John Baptiste Say. I think most of these names are on the wall up here somewhere. And Ralph Raico has a real nice article about this in a book published by the Mises Institute called A Requiem on Marx. And Hans Hoppe wrote on the same topic in the same issue, same book. And it was edited by Yuri Maltsev. It's downstairs somewhere. I'm sure it's on the shelves. If you look under the M's over here, you probably find it. And what this is the libertarian class analysis. It's different than the Marxian class analysis. The Marxian class analysis is about how the capitalist class exploits the working class, that old story. Well, it is sort of a class analysis, but it's not Marxian class analysis. The classes are basically the government class, the people who run the government and who are private citizens but who are connected with the government in some way. They receive subsidies, they run monopoly franchises given to them by the government. They are net beneficiaries of government. That's one class. The other class is the people who are net taxpayers, the people who pay the burden of government. And the exploitation is not between capitalists and workers, but between the government class versus the tax-paying class. And this class can shift. People who are in the tax-paying class can, over time, move into the government class and exploit their neighbors that used to be in power. That's what elections are all about. When you change elections in America, when the Democrats win, they get to exploit the public to pay off their supporters, which are somewhat different than the supporters of the Republicans. When they win, they exploit and plunder the public to pay off their supporters. And so this is shifting. There's nothing permanent about these classes. And so that's part of the genesis of this. And Murray always, in many of his writings, cited Calhoun as a popularizer of this. And why Calhoun? 1850, probably because this sort of thinking was forgotten certainly by economists, not by Rothbard, but by economists. And so I'll read you very briefly what Calhoun had to say, which Murray always cited him, saying this: when once formed, the community, he's talking about democracy, will be divided into two great parties, a major and a minor, between which there will be incessant struggles on one side to retain and on the other to obtain the majority. Consequently, some portion of the community must pay in taxes more than it receives back in disbursements, while another receives in disbursements more than it pays in taxes. The community is thus divided into two great classes, one consisting of those who pay the taxes, the other are the recipients of the proceeds. And then he goes on to say that the power to tax in a democracy will invariably be used, quote, for the purpose of aggrandizing and building up one portion of the community at the expense of another, which will give rise to violent conflicts and struggles between two competing parties to be in charge. And Calhoun also said that a paper constitution would never be sufficient to stop this or to limit this even. And he said that the naive defenders of the Constitution believe that it will be protected by an appeal to reason, truth, justice, or the obligations imposed by the Constitution, Calhoun wrote. In other words, he thinks that, he's referring to the people who thought, well, if you just carry around a copy of the Constitution with you and read it to people and appeal to truth, justice, and fairness, well, they'll just collapse at your feet with the force of your arguments. See a lot of people like that today in Washington, D.C., among the conservatives and some libertarians. But Calhoun said he warned that power-hungry statists will wage a perpetual political war against the Constitution with cunning, falsehood, deception, slander, fraud, and gross appeals to the appetites of the lowest and most worthless portions of the community. These are Calhoun's words, until the restrictions of the Constitution would ultimately be annulled and the government be converted into one of unlimited powers, end quote. Wasn't that prescient? This, of course, is exactly what happened. And want some water here? I just poured some water if you cough. Okay. And so this is the kind of framework that Murray Rothbard was thinking of when he's talking about taxation, and it explains why he has such a radically different view of taxation than your typical public finance economist who talks about benevolent despots. And so armed with this kind of mindset, he takes on a whole long line of what he called myths of tax theory, all sorts of myths that are just filled with textbooks in tax theory. And one of them is the myth of voluntary taxation. And some of you, maybe all of you have run across this. This is the idea of the free rider problem. The basic story that is told about the free rider problem is that to finance public goods, public goods, and I'm not going to define what a public good is. I assume most or all of you know what that is. There's a problem in that in large numbers there will be the inclination by a lot of people to free ride, to assume that, well, George will pay for it. He'll volunteer. Let him pay and I don't pay. Because if I pay and George doesn't, then I'm a chump. And I don't know who wants to be a chump. And so if enough people think like this, that I'm not going to be a chump because they're going to free ride on me, therefore I'm going to free ride, you won't get enough money. You won't raise enough money to adequately fund the government. Therefore, society supposedly volunteers to tax itself. It goes along with taxation, realizing that the benefits of government spending greatly outweigh the costs in terms of taxes, supposedly. But then there's this weird problem of the free rider problem, and so we're all better off. We're all better off if we just volunteer to tax ourselves. understanding that we'll be better off on net because the benefits are so great. Okay, but of course, Murray is typically sort of laser beam accuracy, and he always had the ability to get down to the heart of the matter, which is something I've always strived to be able to do in my research. And as far as that's concerned, just simply says, if coercion is present, it's not voluntary. If coercion is present, it cannot possibly be voluntary. You can theorize all day long about voluntary government, and that is the theory that inspires all the public finance textbooks, that we supposedly tax ourselves voluntarily in the knowledge of this free rider problem. But of course, ask yourself what happens if you tell the IRS, I've had a lot of unexpected bills this year, so I've decided to put yours at the bottom of the list, and I'm not going to pay until next year. See what happens. They'll take your money. They'll one way or another. If you have it in a bank account, they'll get it. The IRS has agreements with every country in the world where that country will let you go and hunt you down and find your income. So if you try to hide your income in Bermuda or someplace like that, that ain't going to work. They'll find you eventually, and so it's not voluntary. And then the next sort of corollary myth that Murray wrote about is, does democracy make it voluntary? After all, we vote for this government, and if we vote for this government, isn't that a voluntary action? We become part of the polity, and we vote. And of course, Murray's answer is no. That's just majority rule tyranny. That's just tyranny by a large gang, as opposed to tyranny by a king, let's say. And the example I use whenever I mention this to students, undergraduates anyway, is example of say he and I walk outside and we see Lou's SUV parked out there, and it's a big 8-cylinder SUV. We kind of like it, and we decide, well, that'd be a nice car to have. We could probably take it to Opelika and get $25,000 for it. We could sell it to somebody. And so we break the window and we start the engine, and then Lou walks out of his office. What's going on here? And that's my car. And so, but we attest to Lou that we are devotees of democracy, and so we believe in democracy very strongly. So let's take a vote to see whose car it is. So he and I vote, it's our car. Lou votes, it's his car. We win, it's our car. That's democracy. It's a majority rule theft. Theft by majority. It's no different than theft by highwayman, criminal, thug, dictator. It's theft. Okay, the fact that a majority voted on the theft doesn't mean it's not theft. And Murray always had an eye for the incendiary, and he pointed out that Adolf Hitler was elected, after all, under German democracy. And he asked the question in one of his writings, does that mean that the Holocaust was voluntary suicide? That after all, that did happen under a government that was created by democracy. He's lampooning the whole idea of the voluntarism under democracy. Okay, and David Hume pointed out a long time ago this idea that because people don't revolt and overthrow the government, some people say, well, they must consent. It must be voluntary because they haven't revolted. And the way Hume dealt with that is to say that just because a conscripted sailor does not jump overboard and commit suicide does not mean that he consented to being conscripted into the Navy. And the same is true of the citizens of the United States or any other countries. Because we don't commit suicide by invading Washington, D.C. with all its missile launchers on the roof of the White House and things like that, doesn't mean we consent. Okay, any more than it meant the citizens of the Soviet Union consented to communism all those years because it took them so long to overthrow their government. And so democracy doesn't make it voluntary. Murray differentiated himself from other public finance economists also by studying and writing about the role of intellectuals in this. And this is why he was not a darling of the public finance profession, I guess. He didn't have very nice things to say about essentially what they were up to, what they were doing. And I'll read you one good example of how he thought about the intellectuals, the theorists of public finance and other areas of economics. This is from his The Ethics of Liberty, a series of essays by Rothbard on ideology. And he says, ideology has always been vital to the continued existence of the state, as attested by the systematic use of ideology since the ancient Oriental empires. The specific content of the ideology has, of course, changed over time in accordance with changing conditions and cultures. In the Oriental despotisms, the emperor was often held by the church to be himself divine. In our more secular age, the argument runs more to the public good and the general welfare. And these are things you see when you study public finance. What sort of tax system will serve the public good and maximize the general welfare? But the purpose is always the same: to convince the public that what the state does is not, as one might think, crime on a gigantic scale, but something necessary and vital that must be supported and obeyed. The reason that ideology is so vital to the state is that it always rests, in essence, on the support of the majority of the public. This support obtains whether the state is a democracy, a dictatorship, or a monarchy. For the support rests in the willingness of the majority, and not, to repeat, of every individual, the majority, to go along with the system, to pay the taxes, to go without much complaint, to fight the state's wars, to obey the state's rules and decrees, and on and on and on. And so propaganda or ideology is always an important tool that's used to sort of dull our senses to the fact that government is robbing us, and to make us think that it's really voluntary after all, and it's really fair. Who wants to be unfair? And he makes the point that the majority of the population has to be convinced that the state is legitimate. Not every single person, the majority of the population. And so that's why Murray Rothbard was such a dangerous man, I guess, and Mises too. He delegitimized the state. He tried to delegitimize the state. And along these lines, I wrote an essay on LouRockwell.com probably a couple years ago now, it seems like, maybe a year and a half, on why I don't vote. And it's sort of a Rothbardian idea, a real simple idea, why I don't vote. And that, we supposedly have this Constitution in the United States that restricts government to certain areas, but nobody pays attention to this in Congress. I spoke to about a dozen or so members of Congress in Ron Paul's office several months ago. They wanted me to talk about my Lincoln book, and went down there, and Ron Paul bought copies for all his colleagues there. And they all sort of come to the agreement that you can't make constitutional arguments against government programs in Washington anymore. Nobody takes them seriously. So the Constitution, as a limit on government, is just simply a dead letter. And Ron Paul and maybe a few of these other guys that were there are the only ones who take it seriously. But even the ones who are taking it seriously were saying, we don't even bother to make these arguments anymore. What's the use? It doesn't work. And so anyway, the gist of my argument was why I don't vote is that what voting does is legitimizes the regime. And we hold an election, and whoever wins says, the people have spoken. I am now legitimized to invade Iraq, Iran, Syria, Lebanon, and do all these things. When Clinton was elected, he never mentioned health care when he was running. He gets in office, and all of a sudden we're going to have a 15% payroll tax and nationalized health care. Where did that come from? But it's legitimate. The people have spoken. And if you pay attention to the news shortly after election days, they're filled with talks about a mandate. Did he get a mandate? The winning of the presidential election. And that's the thinking. The people are said to have given these politicians mandates to do this and that. Mandates to rob them, send them off to die in the Middle East for no reason at all, and things like that. And so my argument was if enough people quit voting, and maybe 5% showed up some year, they could no longer say this. It would delegitimize this criminal gang of ours. And that's sort of Rothbardian thinking on the issue of voting, which is, of course, related to taxation. And so the state, to get us to pay these taxes, relies crucially on a constant barrage of lies and propaganda, and the intellectuals help supply this. And I've got to read you one of my favorite quotes with regard to lies. It let's see, where was it? It was, I wrote this down when I was watching television, watching the news one night, and Paul Begala, one of the most disgusting characters on television, was on CNN or something like this. This was when Bush ran against Al Gore in his first time around. And here's what Paul Begala said. This was during the campaign, before the election, when Bush was elected the first time. He said, quote, "All this insistence on truthfulness on the part of both candidates is getting out of control," end quote. So, and of course, Begala is a paid professional liar. Him and his buddy Carville. That's pretty much what if any of you can remember their behavior during the Clinton years or have read about it, that's pretty much what they did. Every day, they would think of some big lie about what Clinton was up to, and then these two guys would be out there spreading the lie all day long, every day. And the Republicans, of course, do the same thing. They have their Sean Hannity's and Rush Limbaugh's, and I used to listen to Rush Limbaugh. But years ago, I decided that if a Republican was in the White House and they found a severed head in his bed, Rush would be on the radio the next day making excuses for why it wasn't really a severed head, after something else other than a severed head or something. Whatever the Republican line is, he's out there behind him. And so what are some of these items of propaganda, lies, myths that are perpetrated about public finance that Rothbard writes about, and says that there's this intellectual elite that is sort of linked with the state. In return for supplying rationales for statism, they're given government research grants. Their political connections are used to get them endowed chairs at Ivy League schools. And it's not uncommon. A lot of the people you see who are the distinguished Joe Blow professor of public finance at Princeton or something like that, a lot of times I'll look at their credentials and they're really nothing. They went to graduate school and they published maybe one article somewhere, and then they went directly into the government and worked very hard for some politician, and his reward is an endowed chair at Princeton or someplace like that. And there are a lot of talented people at Princeton and Ivy League, but there are also a lot of political hacks. The Kennedy School seems to be a particularly big depository of these types of people. But and you're all familiar probably with a lot of the left-wing propagandists, and because I assume the students among you, you're students, so you're sort of bombarded with it every day in school. And so what I thought I'd do is note that there are some conservatives, or even people who are sometimes referred to as libertarians, who also are in the business of myth-making with regard to the nature of the state. And one of them that I've written about with Walter Block is the whole area of economics called constitutional economics, and this is James Buchanan's gig. And he was a former professor of mine and a colleague of mine for a few years at George Mason. But Walter and I think he's really got off on the wrong track in this area of constitutional economics, as opposed to public choice theory, which his protege Gordon Tullock is more responsible for. Public choice economics, and what this is constitutional economics is Buchanan's attempt to form what he calls a voluntary theory of the state, and I'm going to describe some of it for you. And so it's a subtle thing. I don't think he believes the state really is voluntary, but that it's necessary for the public to think of it as voluntary, because he's not an anarchist, and he thinks if the state is diminished significantly, or if much of it disappears, there will be anarchy and chaos and things like that. And so we have to have this voluntary theory of the state to convince people that it really is voluntary after all. And so how does this body of literature do this? I'll read you some quotes from, this is from The Calculus of Consent by Buchanan and Tullock. "The market and the state are both devices through which cooperation is organized and made possible, where two or more individuals find it mutually advantageous to join forces to accomplish certain purposes." So it sounds like they're saying the market and the state are pretty much the same. There is cooperation in government, after all, and there is cooperation in markets. If I sell you my car, We get together, we talk it over, we agree on a price, we're cooperating. I'm happy, I have your money, you're happy, you have my old used car that I no longer want. That's the free market. And so they insinuate that, well, politics is the same way. People get together and they form political associations and they get things done. And of course, it's vastly different though, because the people in politics get together to scheme to rob somebody. You know, if you and I buy and sell a car, we're getting together to our mutual advantage. But politics is about robbing the Treasury, getting legislation passed that will harm your competitors if you're in business. It's about benefiting at the expense of some other party. It's not mutual benefit of all parties. It's a zero-sum game at best. And in politics, when they model politics, they realize that, you know, market exchange is unanimous. Otherwise, there's not an exchange. That's why it's said to be efficient. If it's voluntary and you and I trade, then in our minds, we're both better off. That's what efficiency is in an economic sense. And so they try to model politics as though it's similarly efficient, but they understand, of course, that politics under democracy is never unanimous. We have majority rule. Even if we have qualified majority of a 2/3 or even 3/4, that's not unanimous. It's 3/4, you know, in a vote. And so they start talking about a relative unanimity. They start talking about the virtues of relative unanimity. And that didn't really fly very well because everybody understands that, well, even if it's 90% unanimity, that's still 90% plundering the 10%, and that's even more unfair. That's even a grosser unfairness. And so from there, Buchanan, mostly, this is not Tulloch, but Buchanan turned to a concept of what he calls conceptual unanimity. And so he has all these models that are based on the work of John Rawls, the philosopher John Rawls, who wrote a book, A Theory of Justice, where he said, let's go through a mind experiment, a mental experiment here, a mind game. And let's pretend that we're all behind the veil of ignorance. That's his phrase, veil of ignorance. What type of society would we choose if we didn't really know anything about the world and think, what kind of... And so Rawls does this, and of course he says, well, socialism, of course, absolutely, for some variety of welfare statism. Buchanan uses the same technique, behind the veils of ignorance, to argue that behind this veil, people would voluntarily choose a good-sized state with antitrust laws and inheritance taxes and all these things that he likes. And it would be voluntary, consensual. Historically, it's not consensual, but in theory, behind the veil of ignorance, it's consensual. And so let me read to you some of the things that he said. That law is legitimate and just, which might have emerged from a genuine social contract in which a person might have participated. That law is illegitimate and unjust, which finds no such contractual basis. So he models or theorizes about a social contract, but doesn't study actual social contracts like the Constitution of the United States or anything like that. He goes on to say, each and every participant in this social contract has implicitly accepted the contract embodied in the rules of the game. So he's going contrary to Hume there by saying if you participate in politics or society, you participate in American democracy, let's say, you're accepting this contract, whatever the contract is, even if you've never seen this contract. I haven't. I've never seen this social contract. It's not in my file cabinet at home anywhere. I've looked for it on numerous occasions. And he goes on to say the social contract is best conceived as subject to continual revision and change, and the consent that is given must be thought of as being continuous. So as politics changes, the tax laws change, programs change, he says it is continuous change, and all this change must be thought of as consensual. He doesn't say why. It just must be thought of as consensual. And then, even when an original contract may never have been made, an actual contract, okay, when current members of the community sense no moral or ethical obligation to adhere to the terms that are defined by the status quo, and when such a contract may have been violated many times over, the status quo defines that which exists. Hence, regardless of its history, it must be evaluated as if it were legitimate contractually. So how about that? Even if the society never agreed to any contract creating a government, and even if it did do that, if the contract is repeatedly broken by the government, it still must be evaluated as though it were legitimate. And so Leland Yeager used to teach here at Auburn and was the von Mises Professor of Economics for several years. He's retired now. I think he still lives here, and he still has a home here in Auburn. He's a bit up in years now, and he was a colleague of Buchanan at the University of Virginia in the 1960s. And he wrote an article in the Cato Journal criticizing all this, and his most memorable line was, in all this literature about conceptual unanimity, conceptual agreement of a social concept, he says, if you see the word conceptual, just substitute the word no and you know what they're talking about. Instead of conceptual unanimity, no unanimity. That's basically what they're talking about. And so if you even have people who are generally in favor of free markets and against price controls and excessive government regulation and the Fed like Buchanan is, even some of them still are very active in creating this idea that government is voluntary somehow. And I've always been bothered by this. I've never been able to understand why they would go to such great lengths and not just simply say, we believe that a certain amount of coercion is necessary for a stable society. I would prefer that they just at least be honest about it, rather than deny that coercion exists. Why don't you just say, I believe anarchy would be a disaster, therefore we need compulsion, coercion, imprisonment, beatings, to some degree, to keep society together. That's, of course, I guess that's why they don't say it, because they know Mises was right about the essential nature of government. So there's a whole long list of myths about taxation too. One myth is I don't know if it's a myth, but it's a gross exaggeration about public goods. Public goods being a certain type of good, like national defense is always used as a typical example, or clean air of a public good. It's indivisible. It's hard, or if not impossible, to exclude anyone from it once it's produced, such as clean air. How could you exclude anybody from breathing clean air if the government were to produce clean air, cleaner air? And so in those cases, government is said to be necessary because of the free rider problem. People won't voluntarily pay enough for such things as clean air or national defense. They'll be inclined to let the other guy pay. Well, these have been grossly exaggerated, the public goods problem. And there have been some good research in economics over it. One of the most famous articles about this taking on public goods is looked at Paul Samuelson's textbook, which I never go anywhere without a copy of Paul Samuelson's textbook here, and which was the most popular textbook in economics for a good 40 years, I think, from the beginning of 1948, maybe 35 years. And the top example it used of public good in all those years was the lighthouse. A lighthouse that emits a big light over the harbor so that any ships that come by, once the light is out there, any ships come by benefit from it, and it's very difficult, if not impossible, supposedly, to exclude any passing ship from the benefit of the light in the lighthouse. Therefore, government must finance lighthouses, is the argument. And Samuelson thought this was such an ironclad example of a public good that he featured it, highlighted it in his textbook for decades, and as did other economists who wrote textbooks on this. But Ronald Coase came along, the University of Chicago lawyer/economist, legal scholar, and he wrote a paper called The Lighthouse in Economics in the Journal of Law and Economics, where he did some historical research on this, and he found that in England for many, many years there were privately financed lighthouses, that the merchants whose goods were being crashed upon the rocks in the dark in the harbors thought that it was a pretty good investment to chip in, to donate, to go in with business partners and build and operate lighthouses to protect their cargo. And they did. So he tells the whole story of how this came into being. and totally shut the lighthouse public goods article or theory out of the water. And after, I had been familiar with this article, and I went on vacation myself once in near where I live, and it was on the Delaware Bay near the Atlantic Ocean. And there's some restaurant I went to, you buy dinner and they take you on a sunset cruise of the Delaware Bay. And there's some broken down lighthouses on the East Coast over there. You can see the remnants of these old ancient lighthouses that are no longer in use. And the captain of this boat, he's blabbing about here's where the dolphins often feed in the evening and things like that. And he points to this old lighthouse and he says, oh yeah, about 120 years ago, merchants from New England were having trouble with their cargo ships crashing on the rocks right over here, and he points to these big rocks that jut out of the Delaware Bay, and he said, so they all chipped in and built a series of lighthouses all up and down the East Coast, all the way to the Carolinas and Georgia. And just they went on to point out some fish in the water and things like that. So it was kind of amusing to me that he's some guy that cleans fish for a living and drives a boat. Knew more than Paul Samuelson did about the financing of public goods and the lighthouse case. And I tried to get the Earhart Foundation to give me a summer research grant to go to all the beaches on the East Coast and investigate these lighthouses, but they saw through the scam. They wouldn't give me the money to do that. But so that's just not to say that these types of things do not exist, that there's no such thing as unwillingness to voluntarily pay for something like a lighthouse. But if there is a genuine demand for that, people will innovate. They will find ways to do this. And an important point here that Murray made and other people have made also is that whenever the government steps in and takes over lighthouses or whatever, it puts an end to any incentive anybody would have to solve that problem voluntarily. Like the merchants who found a way to put the money together to produce lighthouses. If the government would have taken that over, why would they step in and do that? They would be illegal, probably. The government usually grants itself a monopoly on these sorts of things, and it would tax all the shipping companies who do business on the East Coast to pay for the lighthouse. And so with a lot of the so-called public goods problems, people innovate. People figure out how to solve these problems if you just let them. But the government usually short-circuits these efforts. The market is a discovery process. When we have problems like this, people will discover ways to solve them because there's money in it. They're losing a lot of money on such things as boat ships sinking on the seacoast. And also with regard to public goods, the government, of course, creates a lot of these problems, public goods problems with traffic, and bottlenecks and things like that. It's the source of a lot of these problems. And very little of what government does is provision of public goods anyway. In one of my articles, I made this point. There's a big publication. If you're a city manager, there's a big book that comes out once a year. I think it's called the International City Management Manual. And I used to use this in some of my research when I was writing articles on local government, the economics of local government. And it has a big long table in every issue of all the types of things city governments do. Leaf raking, snow removal, everything. There's hundreds of things. And in this table, they have a percentage of cities that use private companies to do these things. So for every single function, there's a little percentage on over the column, and it'll be 13%, 80%, or whatever of how many of the cities in their sample of hundreds of cities in America who rely on private companies, and there was not a single item that had a zero in the percentage column. And every single thing the local governments do, there are private companies that do these things, and they invariably do it a lot better, I think. So if you just look at something like this, it's hard. I used to give this table to my students as a homework problem, tell me. Pick out where the public goods are and make the case tell me why this is a public good, and it fits all the definitions of a public good and it cannot be financed privately. And of course that's a hard thing to do because every single one of these things is financed privately somewhere in inadequate amounts that some cities are perfectly fine to have it supplied that way. And so that's another thing. Another thing Murray took on was the myth of externalities, external benefits and costs being so important that we need taxes. You probably all know the standard story. It was first given credit. I'm sure it was discussed earlier than this, but an economist named Arthur Pigou, British economist, Arthur C. Pigou, is credited with the at least popularizing in the economics profession the theory of externalities and how smoke rising from a factory affects people other than the factory owners and harms others, and therefore one of the solutions to this problem of external cost is to tax the factory owner, because taxes will reduce production of whatever it is, the steel mill, and it will therefore lead to a more optimal level of production that cuts down on the pollution. And these kinds of taxes are called Pigouvian taxes in the economics literature, taxes with regard to externalities. And of course there's the flip side, external benefits. Education has long been said to have external benefits. You people educate yourself, you're the primary beneficiary, but a more educated society tends to be more productive in an economic sense, less prone to crime and so forth, and so society as a whole is said to benefit from education. Therefore, you are spreading benefits. You don't even know it, did you? That you're just by sitting there and being up listening to this stuff, you're benefiting the whole world. But the problem is, therefore, there's going to be too little of this, too little education, because it's an unpriced resource. There's nobody you're not being paid for it. So you should be paid for it. So therefore, we're going to use tax dollars to subsidize your education, so that we can have even more of this benefiting the world with this sort of thing. And so the whole apparatus of what's called welfare economics has long been based on these two stories about the pervasiveness of external costs and benefits. And of course, pollution exists, and it always has. As long as there's human beings, there's been pollution. And here's a trick question. This is a pretty smart crowd. It probably is not a trick. But how would the environment be cleaner? How was the environment made cleaner by the invention of the automobile? I would argue that the environment is much cleaner as a result of the invention of the automobile. Yeah, it would all be up to our eyeballs in horse manure if it wasn't for the automobile. And, as long as there's human beings, there's going to be some degree of pollution. You live in society, you're not going to be pollution free. But just like the public goods problem, this has been grossly exaggerated. Rothbard argued, and he was right about that. For a number of reasons. You got the intellectuals spinning these stories, making you think that there's a problem everywhere, we need to tax everything. But another famous article illustrated this, and it did the same kind of thing that Coase did. It picked one of the big examples that the economics profession had settled on in the textbooks of an external benefit. Education is kind of boring. Everybody knows about that. So the books didn't dwell so much on education, the story I just told you. But they used to use the example of bees and beekeepers and apple orchards, of where the idea was, the bees pollinate apple trees, which provides an external benefit to the owner of the orchard, and the apple trees feed the bees, which provides an external benefit to beekeepers. So there's sort of a reciprocal external benefit here of apple orchard owners and beekeepers. And the problem, supposedly, is that, again, this is an unpriced resource, that there's nobody paying anybody to do this. Therefore, there will be too few bees and too few apple trees in the economy. Of all the things for economists to worry about, there's too few bees in the world because it's not optimal. And so this, again, in years ago in the textbooks, if you read about external costs and benefits on the chapter on market failure, you would read this story of how there's a need to subsidize beekeepers and apple orchard owners to encourage more of this because it's unpriced. There's no mechanism where apple orchard owners could pay the beekeepers and vice versa. Therefore, there's a suboptimal amount of honey and apples in the economy. It's not perfect. It's not the amount of honey and apples you'd get in perfectly competitive equilibrium. I'm not making this up. This used to be in the textbook. But anyway, there was an economist named Stephen Chung who used to work at the University of Washington in Seattle. And of course, Washington State is the apple capital of North America. A lot of apples come from Washington State. And he knew a little bit he knew some people who were in the apple orchard business and things. And he began researching this. And lo and behold, he found that for decades, there were very detailed contracts between orchard owners and beekeepers to do exactly what the textbook said could never happen, where they would pay the apple orchard owners were paying the beekeepers to move their bees closer to the orchard at certain times of the year, and so that they would all benefit. They had and he had, when he wrote the article, part of the words of the article I have in my hand here a copy of a contract from the Washington State Apple Growers Association with the beekeepers, and they've been doing this for decades and decades because they realize there's money to be made. You know, that's the chutzpah of these economists who think they're so smart that a guy who owns an apple orchard will not realize that he could make more money selling apples with more apples. How do you get more apples? Get more bees in there to pollinate the things that they couldn't possibly think of that and make a business arrangement with beekeepers who are everywhere in a place like in rural parts of Washington State. And so they did. And Chung, it's kind of entertaining, right, about these contracts were so detailed that the apple orchard owners would spray pesticides on their apple trees once or twice a year, and it was in the contract that they would give at least a week's notice to the beekeepers before they sprayed, so that they could get the beehives and put them farther distance, so the bees wouldn't be harmed by the pesticide or anything that they're spraying to keep other critters off their orchards. And so this was an important article in economics too, because it picked again one of the top examples the profession used as an external benefit and shot it out of the water. And this is not to say that these types of things don't exist, but again, if the government would have stepped in there and said, okay, we're going to start subsidizing beekeepers, which they do anyway, there are subsidies to beekeepers in the federal budget, mostly because beekeepers like to get the money. That's the rationale. But it would have short-circuited any attempts to find voluntary ways to deal with this. And that's generally what happens. And so that's another example of sort of Rothbardian analysis of this, which is always very appealing to me, because you have these people like Paul Samuelson who are, I used to call them swivel chair economists that never get out off their swivel chair in their office and look out the window at the real world. They would model oligopoly, market failure, but they would never do even the most basic, simple, empirical observation and the things that they were writing about, like the beekeepers. Okay. Another thing that Murray took on, those of you who have published or have studied public finance probably have heard of the benefit principle. The benefit principle, here's what Samuelson says about it. There is the general notion that different people should be taxed in proportion to the benefit they can be expected to receive from public activity. So if you receive higher benefit, in theory, you should pay higher taxes. Now, of course, the problem with that is benefits are subjective. When I buy a car or a shirt or anything, it's subjective, the value I get from enjoying this thing. There's no, utility is not cardinal utility. You can't measure these. But the presumption behind things like this is utility is cardinal and measurable, and therefore taxes should be set equal to the cardinal benefit, measurable benefit that people get from government services. Impossible. Can't do that. And of course, Murray points that out right away. I'll close here with the Rothbardian take on tax loopholes. And of course, once again, Murray was totally different on his analysis of tax loopholes. Most economists will make the argument that tax loopholes are a bad thing for a number of reasons. Well, people spend a lot of time figuring out how to get the loopholes and to keep the loopholes. They hire accountants And the theory is that that's all wasteful, that people would be better off working and producing goods and services, not hiring accountants and lawyers to figure out how to lower their taxes. That's waste. Just in the past year, President Bush announced he wanted tax reform that was, quote, fair without tax loopholes for special interests. There are always special interests, these loopholes. And it was also revenue neutral. That is, the government budget would not be diminished at all. The Republicans in the House of Representatives said this to the Associated Press: a flat tax that gets rid of deductions would be desirable, while other reformers argued for reducing the income tax rates that are, quote, paid for by eliminating or scaling back tax deductions. And so the Democrats and the Republicans in America all want to scale back tax deductions, these wasteful loopholes. The Rothbard, again, could always zero in on the essence of all this. And the underlying premise behind all this is that there's some level of government expenditure which exists today that is immutable and unchallengeable. That when they say revenue neutral, that means it's a given that government should always be at least as big as it is and bigger, and therefore your pocketbook should be smaller. If the government's bigger, how can it get bigger? It has to take more of your money. How can it take more of your money? Eliminate your tax deductions. That's what it's going to do. And this idea that the time spent by citizens trying to lower their taxes is wasteful is sometimes called welfare loss in the public finance literature. But what they're talking about is, say I pay an accountant $500 and he saves me $10,000 in taxes. That's inefficient. That's said to be inefficient. It's not inefficient to me though. If I save $10,000 this year, I'm going to hire this guy next year and the year after too, if he can keep saving me money. And generally in economics, we know that if people continue a certain type of behavior over and over again, that's the epitome of economic efficiency. Because in their minds, they must be thinking this is a mutually advantageous trade, hiring the accountant, that makes me better off. If it didn't make me better off, I wouldn't do it. And if it didn't make him better off, he wouldn't take my money and do the work. And so it's just the essence of efficiency. And of course, if my tax accountant saves me $10,000, the government loses $10,000. And in Rothbard's view, and in my view, that's a good thing. Since there are no longer any constitutional restraints of any kind on government, the only constraint we could really have is reducing our taxes somehow and reducing the amount of fuel that the beast has to survive on. And so therefore we could call guys like James, tax guys, heroes of society. They're heroes of society. They find us tax loopholes. Another clear-headed analysis on loopholes that Rothbard spoke of is mainstream economists, even conservative economists who call themselves free market economists, will say that they're against tax deductions for certain types of investments because it creates an inefficiency, because it causes more capital to go into those industries that benefit from the tax loopholes, so-called, the tax deductions, at the expense of what would happen on a genuinely free market where no market was distorted by tax cuts, let's say. And so, and that is appealing to students of economics usually, because it is true, you know, if you have a tax deduction for industry X but not industries Y and Z, you will artificially cause more capital to flow into industry X because investment there will become higher, more profitable, because you don't have to pay tax or as much tax on your profits in that industry. And so, so generally most economists will say this is a bad thing. But Rothbard, a good student of Bastiat, Friedrich Bastiat, always looking at the opportunity cost side of these things, asked, well, what happens if we do that? What is the consequence of this if we eliminate the tax deduction for industry X? The consequence is increased government revenue. And so what is the government going to do? And generally, of course, Rothbard would think there's something evil with the money. It's going to do something bad with the money. And so it's not a foregone conclusion that this is necessarily inefficient, because after all, what you're doing is you're taking money out of the private sector, which generally spends the money much more efficiently than government does. You're giving the money to government bureaucrats who are inherently inefficient, and you're calling that efficient. You're taking money from people who spend it efficiently, and you're giving it to people who spend it inefficiently. That's efficient. That's the standard mainstream public finance analysis. And I think Rothbard was dead right on that point as well. And the final thing I'll say is, I dug up in this little article I wrote on this a quote from von Mises. He was at a 1952 conference in which people, the other economists there, conservative economists, were complaining about all the tax loopholes that were popping up in the tax code at the time in the early 1950s. And why were they complaining? Not because they personally wanted to pay more tax, but they were economists, and they thought this was leading to inefficiencies for the reasons I just gave. Not everyone is getting them. And here's what Mises said. He said, "Let us be grateful for the fact that there are still such things as those the honorable gentlemen call loopholes. Thanks to these loopholes, this country is still a free country, and its workers are not yet reduced to the status and the distress of their Russian colleagues." And end quote. And this is shortly after World War II, when the income tax rates skyrocketed. There were a lot of people with not gigantic incomes who were paying 90% income tax rates during World War II. And so by 1952, this sort of thing was still in the people's memory. And of course, that's why there were so many loopholes. People couldn't survive with these high tax rates if there weren't loopholes. And so that's my final example of how Rothbard dissented from the mainstream on public finance. And maybe I have a minute or two for a question, if anybody has any. The guy who comes to turn my switch off hasn't showed up yet. So if anybody has a brilliant commentary or anything, if not, we can go drink some more coffee, I guess. Okay, we'll call it a day then.